Hello, good evening, everyone. So nice to see so many familiar faces and some new faces as well here. My name is Juan de Lara. I am the director of the Armenian Institute, and it's a huge pleasure to welcome you to this event, this lecture, given by Elena Papassissa on reshaping Armenian letterforms from Paris to Beirut and Yerevan. So just a brief introduction of our speaker, and as well, I think I should request to everyone who is attending via our Zoom link also to please mute themselves for the duration of this lecture. We will have an opportunity to have Q&As at the end. As I was saying, the event of today will explore a little bit about the different ways in which Elena has been researching the type of typographies and fonts used for Armenian letters and calligraphy. The Armenian alphabet was created in the 5th century by Mefrub Mashdod, and I think the idea behind its creation was to give the Armenian language an alphabet of its own and also explore and identify a form, a shape that was as close as possible to the truest possible Christian spirit of it. And I might address Gagik, our head of library, to check if that what I'm saying is actually true. Am I? Yeah, I'm going to. So he referenced a lot of different calligraphies, including Greek, Coptic, Arabic, and I believe I like to believe that also Ge'ez is from Ethiopian. That's contested. Apart from that, Elena will be focused today on the last 200 years. On 4 historical periods in which the typography was developed. She has identified these periods as the following. The first one in Paris in the 1850s, when the Armenian printer and publisher Čanik Aramean introduced the Armenian types in the magazine La Colombe du Massis with Western features. The second instance was in Beirut in 1968 with a different artist, Onnik Awetisean, who published the new lowercase letters from Armenians. And last period will also be the ones in which the most recent typographic trends have filled the streets of Yerevan in Armenia. A little bit about our lecturer today, about Elena. She's a type designer, type consultant, independent researcher, and a lecturer in graphic design and typography at Oxford Brookes University. Since 2013, she has been running her own practice, collaborating with international type foundries and type designers, and design studios in London. Elena has designed several Armenian fonts, such as Noto Armenian, Avenir, Next World Armenian, and Jaguar Armenian. Probably fonts that if you're Armenian, you have used before. She holds a bachelor's degree in graphic design and visual communication, and an MA in communication and design for publishing from ISAI Urbino in Italy. And I apologize, I have to read this, but it's quite an impressive CV, I have to say. So, she also has an MA in typeface design from the University of Reading, where she was awarded also a PhD in typography and graphic communication in 2020, titled Conventions, Traditionalism, Latinization, and Modernity in Armenian Typefaces Across Type-Making Technologies from 1512 to 1977. Congratulations for that PhD, and thank you so much for coming here today and educate us on the different ways in which we can design with Armenians. So please join me in welcoming Elena. And
thank you, Juan, for the introduction. Good evening, everybody. And thank you for having me here. I'm grateful and honored to have been invited today. I want to thank Gagik for encouraging me and for putting me in touch as well with Erika, who is the event organizer. And I want also to thank the team at the Armenian Institute and at the Sunbright Foundation for making this event today possible. Today, as Juan already mentioned, I will be discussing the modernization of the Armenian typographic script and its impact on the development of subsequent Armenian typefaces. I will focus on the introduction of Latinized Armenian types in Paris in the 1850s, and on the typeface used in the 1868 publication in Beirut by the artist Onnik Awetisean. And I will conclude by examining some recent trends in Armenian newspapers. But first, I would like to tell you a little bit about my work and how I got interested in Armenian type, its history and development. I spent almost 50% of my time teaching graphic design and typography to undergraduate students. And there is not much time really during university time to carry out research. So if you're an academic, you probably know what I'm talking about. So I've been juggling my rest of the time between design and researching, giving talks, and writing articles about the topic of Armenian types. So as I already said, I'm a type designer, so I draw letters for a living. I have been running my own practice since 2013, and I have been designing both Latin and Armenian fonts. I would say that my practice supports my research, and my research underpins my practice. So this is something that is quite important for me. In 2011, I did an MA in typeface design at the University of Reading, where I designed a typeface with a reverse contrast. And I designed it in different scripts, as you can see, also in Armenian. A few years later, I had the opportunity to do a PhD at the same university with the support of an HRC grant in partnership with Design Star. So as Juan already mentioned, my topic was conventional, traditionalism, Latinization, and modernity in Armenian typefaces across typemaking technologies from 1512 to 1977. And this evening, I'm going to share with you some of my finding of the PhD. So it was during my MA and my PhD that I traveled to Yerevan in a couple of occasions to carry out research in archives and libraries. When I visited Yerevan, this is what I came across. Street signs such as this engraved plaque that recall traditional lettering known as yergatagir, iron letters, and also, as you can see from the picture below, very ordinary signage, yes, that you would come across in everyday life. So here the parallel between the Armenian and the Latin script show how standardized and westernized the Armenian script can be. Another example, representative of traditional Armenian style, was impressive hand-painted theater posters, which I think has almost completely disappeared from Yerevan. Yeah. But in addition to this is also what you would come across. So shop signs can tell us a lot about the current taste and use of the Armenian script in the capital, particularly when seen next to the Latin script. Armenian letters have some European influence. You can see serifs. So if you look like, maybe I should look with a pointer. I don't know if everyone knows what a serif is. So for example, look at this, it's in here. You can also recognize Latin letters in the middle of Armenian words. And I think that the style look quite familiar to Western readers. So looking at the graphic scene, we can notice a strong contrast between tradition and modernity. But the search for modernity is not something that is specific to the 21st century. At different stages in history, the traditional forms of printed lowercase typefaces, like the one at the top, were modified to look modern and Western. The first and major step towards the modernization of Armenian typographic script was taken in the middle of the 19th century by the Armenian punch-card printer and publisher Yerevan in Constantinople, and soon after by the Armenian printer and publisher Čanik Aramean in Paris. So these new typefaces marked the introduction of European typographic conventions in Armenian fonts. This process is known as Latinization. In the 19th century, the Armenian territory was split between two empires. We had the Tsarist Russia in the east and the Ottoman Empire in the west. For this reason, a significant numbers of Armenian people had emigrated. The 19th century was a period of active contact between Armenians and Europeans, particularly from France and Italy. A large number of Armenian students were sent to Europe in order to receive education. There, they lived in the stimulating atmosphere of the French Revolution of 1830 and 1848. These young Armenian scholars returned to Constantinople with the wish for freedom from the Ottoman Empire. The assimilation of European revolutionary concept and the attempts of Armenian to affirm their national identity coincided with the development of a modern Armenian language at the expense of a classical Armenian language known as Rabar. Also, with the introduction of a modern language, Armenian publications no longer restricted their contents to religious or scholarly topics, but they started to feature translation of European contemporaries, particularly French authors. New literary genres such as satire, theater, prose, and journalism were introduced. Journalism was the most effective as a tool to spread literacy, literary, social, economical, and political ideas. A significant event in the history of Armenian typefaces was the publication of a bilingual journal that appeared in 1855 in Paris, La Colombe du Massis. This was the first Armenian printed illustrated journal produced there. It was established in 1855 by Gabriele Iwawowski from the Methodist congregation in Venice, who at the time was in Paris. The journal was printed and published by Čanik Aramean until 1858. Aramean had been trained in Constantinople as a tailor and combined his friendship with the practice of typesetting. In 1846, he moved to Paris. He was a very active printer, publisher, as well as writer on issues of national importance and educational matters. Aramean was granted the right to print books and journals using the fonts he owned at Valder, Ernst Mayr, and Renquet printing houses, under the Aramean publishing trademark. Not only were the new Latinized types that you can see here used throughout La Colombe du Massis, but in his first section, entitled Connaissance subtile, Čanik Aramean presented the new Armenian types, explaining the reason behind his typographic modernization and inviting readers to receive his new type forms. It was most unusual for editors to use the first pages or the first issue of their journals to talk about the typefaces used by their publishers. So this really demonstrates the importance of the new typefaces used in La Colombe du Massis. Now, to understand the reasons for the changes proposed by Aramean, let's have a look at the traditional color gear style. The color gear style was characterized by relatively low contrast, sharp angular lines and junctions, giving the script a regular, almost rigid appearance, although there were also some rounded letters. A particular feature of the style was the slant. So it was leaning forward. Yeah? Aramean highlighted four main imperfections in traditional color gear types. So first of all, say color gear types leans forward. Not only does this make letters look ugly, but it also creates difficulties reading and tires the eyes. Secondly, almost every letter has an angular shape. This fails to convey comeliness, causes boredom and reading difficulty, especially to those learning to read, since almost all the letters appear to be similar to each other. And thirdly, a number of letters are very similar to each other and constantly get confused with one another, such as A and T, B, D, Z, and K and S. Sorry, V and S. Fourthly, printers encountered difficulties because of the shape of some letters. It became necessary to make letters with shortened descenders to avoid creating a distance between them and tail letters. Also, the excessive extension of upper and lower extremities of a number of letters creates a distance between consecutive letters. In casting, these extremities tend to break repeatedly, in particularly letters me and ye. So how did Aramean propose to resolve these shortcomings? First and foremost, the face was upright instead of slanted. The ratio 1:1:1, typical of the proportions of a traditional Bolorgir style, was modified for use with Latin typefaces. Ascenders and descenders were shorter than the dimension of a base character height. So you can see this in the second image. These new typefaces had a high contrast between thick stems and thin serifs. And as in Latin typefaces, serifs were attached to the endostems of letters on both sides. Also, the tails of letters that traditionally had a long horizontal stroke attached to the descender were folded upright. In this way, it was possible to prevent the breaking of the tail when it extended outside of the block of type. So the bits that was outside the block of type was really fragile. Another noticeable change was the replacement of some Armenian characters by letters from the Latin alphabet. For example, letter K was replaced by the Latin letter F, J by the Latin letter R, T by the Latin S, K by the Latin H, and V by the Latin N. These new types that you see in here were first used in La Colombe du Massis in 1857 and 1858. So, in all this, Aramean's aim to revise the Bolorgir style was mainly to improve legibility and readability, using the Latin script as a criterion for assessment. In his announcement, he described European types as beautiful and regular. In 1856, Aramean wrote an article in La Colombe du Massis, stating that the new types he owned and used for the publication were the work of several individuals. And he says, on our part, we haven't invented anything new. All 5 forms of typefaces found Massiasa Gavni, that is, those letters named Bark, Massis, Arevelk, Ani, and Arsha Louise, have been engraved and published according to the principle laid out by various individuals. Having cited the names of these typefaces, we consider it our duty to talk briefly about these respectable individuals. In the same article, Aramean acknowledged the punch cutter, printer and publisher Yerevan from Constantinople as the first who aimed to rectify the Bolorgir style and the first to produce Latinized Armenian types and use them for printing. In 1847, Mihentesian had published an announcement entitled Announcement upon the Subject of Newly Fashioned Typefaces. His purpose was to address the shortcomings of the script, enhance printing, and awaken Armenian national identity. It is likely that Čanik Aramean read Mihentesian's announcement and decided to work on improving the forms of the Bolorgir style. The initiative taken by Mihentesian shows the modernization of Armenian script did not happen in isolation. Indeed, we can find individuals from various Armenian diasporic communities connecting between each other and discussing modernizing Armenian typefaces. For example, before publishing his announcement in 1847, Mihentesian had made connections with members from the Mekitarist congregation in Venice and possibly Vienna. The Mekitarist fathers were the first Armenian body of scholars who in the 18th and 19th centuries shaped most of the ideas on Armenian history, language, and literature. They were also publishers, so they had actually quite a big reputation as publishers. Now, whereas the Mekitarist had used very traditional Bolorgir style, which was considered by printers and publishers to be the model against which to compare other Armenian typefaces, in 1830s, they began to make calligraphic experiments showing a more Western appearance. In his pamphlet, Mihentesian informed readers that the priest Peter Minassian from the Mekitarist congregation in Venice the author of this calligraphy book, visited his printing establishment in Constantinople, advised and encouraged him to proceed revising the shapes of Armenian letters in Bolorgir style. The Mekhitarist in Vienna might have also been supportive, as demonstrated by similarity between Micentesian's type and some calligraphy work by one of the Viennese father, which appeared in 1838, so 9 years before Micentesian published his pamphlet. The very productive networking that set itself up at the time is strongly linked with the ideas behind the emergence of national movements. Strong and frequent connections were formed among Armenian printers, publishers, editors, and activists throughout the diaspora. For Armenians, nationalism in the 19th century was a liberation movement aimed at freeing Western Armenia from the oppression of the Ottoman Empire. The revolutionary movements taking place in Europe encouraged some Armenians to bring forward ideas of modernization and nationhood. The reform on the Armenian Bolorgir types in the 1850s would have served this purpose. However, while there were Armenians that supported the modernization of their script, there were also those that reacted negatively to the specific change. A noteworthy example is a letter written by an influential individual in Java, today Jakarta, and published in 1861 on the Parisian journal Paris. It was a type used in this journal that triggered the negative reaction. In the letter, the editor of Paris was rebuked for supporting the new Armenian upright style. The author of the letter expressed his concern for Armenian script, language, and identity. He saw the introduction of new Armenian typefaces imitating European typography style as, and I quote, an issue of national importance. The letter certainly affected the editor. Not only did he publish it in the journal, but he also changed publisher and restored the classical Bolorgir style in all subsequent issues. So the aim of Čanik Aramean to replace the forms of the old Bolorgir style by introducing new Armenian typefaces emulating European conventions was not fully realized. However, we should not underestimate Aramean impact on the production of subsequent Armenian typefaces. His son had readily found purchases for them in Constantinople, so there was still interest in Aramean's type. And it was up to printers, publishers, and editors to decide whether to use the new Latinized typeface, and when they chose to, the extent to which they would replace traditional ones. The second part of our talk brings us to Beirut in the 20th century, when another noteworthy attempt to reform the letters of the Armenian Bolorgir style took place with a typographic work done by Armenian artist Onnik Awetisean. While Awetisean's work, while Awetisean is well known as an artist, his typographic work is not really and widely recognized. In the 1930s, Armenia was part of the Soviet Union. At the time, the traditional Bolorgir style was still widely used as evidenced by publications. To address the issue of printing costs, the Armenian government invited type specialists and artists from Soviet Union and the diaspora to propose ideas for a reform of Armenian printing types. This initiative was not successful, as none of the proposed solution was accepted by the government. However, the 1932 initiative arose great interest with Armenian artist Onnik Awetisean. Onnik Awetisean was born in 1898 in the town of Bursa in Turkey, but moved to Constantinople in his childhood. In 1921, he moved to Vienna to study painting and etching by aquafortis at the Vienna State Institute of Graphic Arts. And in 1925, he went to Rome, where he graduated at the Academy of Arts 2 years later. Afterwards, he moved to Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. He moved to Cyprus in 1936, where he embarked on the reform of Armenian printing types. His experiments were published in 1946 with the title Experiments on Reforming the Printed Letters of the Bolorgir Style. The publication is extensive. It's a book of about 150 pages, containing information on Armenian writing, type, typography, observations on the shortcomings of the Bolorgir style, and of course, Awetisean's experiments on reforming the printed letters of the Bolorgir style. So, encouraged by Armenians' favorable reception of this publication on modernizing the Armenian printing type, Awetisean decided to make amendments to his early designs and to attempt some new solutions. To that effect, he wrote a pamphlet entitled New Lowercase Letters for Printing in Armenian. It was published in Beirut in 1968. The 60-page pamphlet was specially prepared to display the new types and to promote its sale and use among Armenians in diaspora and Soviet Armenia. This typeface is significant as it is representative of the attempt to reform Armenian printed letters in the 1930s, as well as of a struggle for Armenians to keep pace with the new type-making technologies. I will say a little bit more about this later. You can observe in here the striking contrast between Awetisean's type and the traditional Bolorgir. The pamphlet uses his innovative cast metal type, which was made available at 10-point size in 1968 by the Fonderie de Caractères Typographiques in Beirut, in Lebanon. Now let's proceed through a brief analysis of Awetisean's new type. According to Awetisean, the Bolorgir had become outmoded and its print version had shortcomings in readability as well as underprinting and space-saving considerations. The shortcomings identified by Onik were the same as those outlined by Aramean in the 19th century. First, slanting reduced readability, whereas regular and vertical letters give a sense of balance and stability. Angular aspect of Bolorgir, with very few curved shapes, makes reading tiresome. The Bolorgir contains a number of letters that can be confused with each other, as exemplified by these three pairs of letters. The second shortcoming relates to the cost of printing. Compared to Roman type, the Armenian Bolorgir occupies approximately 25% more space in print. And the third issue concerns authenticity. Awetisean referred to the number of changes the Bolorgir underwent, and particularly to the typefaces that appeared in 1855 in Colombe du Massis, as we saw earlier. So, how did Awetisean address those shortcomings? His type was at least 20% more economical in space than other traditional Bolorgir fonts. In order to obtain this, Awetisean chose to devise the type as an upright style, as Aramean had done a century earlier. Amendments to lowercase letters were not arbitrary, but based on a frequency count he had obtained by estimating the number of occurrences of Armenian letters per 10,000 characters. For example, A is a high-frequency letter, 14.60%, which means that in an Armenian writing, 1 in every 7 letters is an A. The frequency count criterion was also applied to give a more distinctive rounded aspect to the alphabet. By rounding letters like this, he managed to bring rounded letters to more than 75%, thereby reducing the space between letters when composing. Other noticeable changes were made on the basic structures of letters that can be confused with each other, such as those shown here. Awetisean also narrowed letters by reducing the tail of lowercase letters, as appears here. These amendments would enable composers to fit more text on a page. And finally, he made changes to the vertical proportions of some letter forms by shortening them and removing their descender. Those letters lost their descending stroke and they were transformed into short letters. Awetisean described his new lowercase letters as a new graphic system for printing and its own special rules of construction, proportions, and rhythm, consisting of a number of reformed letter forms, a different distribution of their heights, special proportions of oblique, wide, and narrow letters. The system remains faithful to the general style and aspect of Armenian writing, without making any radical changes to the already existing letter images. The new lowercase letters, despite being a novel and original typeface, is capable of being read at first sight. Awetisean understood the pivotal role of readers in determining the success of his new lowercase letters. Appealing to readers was not something new, as evidenced by these two 19th century publications that we discussed before. Both introduce innovative Armenian type and invite readers to receive the new forms. Similarly, at the end of his 1968 pamphlet, Awetisean appealed to the Soviet Armenian authorities to consider his reform type and asked them to compare these forms with others and judge them with a spirit of progressive taste. He asked them to use the new lowercase letters in various publications, particularly in journals. The reader would slowly become acquainted with the new forms. Awetisean wanted his new forms of lowercase and uppercase letters to be produced as metal type. So he approached several punch cutters in Cairo and Beirut, and finally his types were made a 10-point size, thanks to the support and the work of two compatriots based in Aleppo. Some correspondence I came across at the type collection of the Department of Typography and Graphic Design at the University of Reading revealed that Awetisean was eager to have his type passed by one of the leading companies in the field of typesetting in the 20th century, linotype. Linotype contributed to the mechanization of the printing process, resulting in the improvement in the speed of printing production, particularly useful for newspapers. So just a few words about linotype. The Linotype Company was established in New York in 1866 with the aim of distributing the linotype composing machine invented by Otmar Mergenthaler. Linotype was a hot metal line casting machine that combined a typewriter-like keyboard with a hot metal typecasting unit. The keyboard operator would assemble matrices by entering words through the keyboard, and then when each line was complete, this was cast as a single line of type known as flag. In 1968, Awetisean approached Ran Gabeyan, salesman at the Linotype Middle East Liaison Office. And he contacted him to produce slugs of his new Armenian typeface. Gabeyan was born in 1937 in Cairo. He was the son of two Armenians who have emigrated to Egypt to escape the 1915 Armenian genocide. He spoke Arabic, French, and Armenian fluently. At first, Gabeyan considered Awetisean's type not a very desirable one, and with Walter Tracy, manager at Linotype and Machinery in London, decided to reject Awetisean's request. But in 1970, when Awetisean revisited the office to show them a new Armenian design, Gabeyan was so impressed that he decided to support Awetisean's endeavors to produce linotype matrices of his new typeface. So A was meant as an improvement on his 1968 type, and B would be basically the italic of A, so of this previous version here. There were also other versions submitted to Linotype. So according to Gabeyan, these were proofs sketched on graph paper to find the best design solution to fit the Linotype technology and the market potentiality. Gabeyan described the new Armenian typefaces free of confusing characters, clear and desirable, especially in its italic forms, which he personally thought was superb. Gabeyan needed to justify the manufacturing of new Armenian matrices in order to convince Linotype and Machinery to take on his new commitment. He prompted Awetisean to find a wealthy Armenian benefactor willing to sponsor the project and to cover the cost of preparation of Armenian typeface. He also told Awetisean to collect letters from well-known Armenian printers, saying that it was a desirable typeface and that if linotype matrices of the typeface was made available, they would buy them. The letter of support was signed by the best 10 Armenian linotype customers based in Lebanon. The letter concluded, "We declare that if your company manufactures linotype matrices of Mr. Awetisean's design to start with the upright style and italic in 10 point, we believe that this project will be met with great satisfaction, and we will seriously consider to have them." Unfortunately, this recommendation did not produce the desired outcome. The signatories did not commit themselves to purchasing matrices of Awetisean's type or linotype machines. And as a salesman, Gabeyan knew that for the company, the sales of matrices were regarded as secondary to the sales of matrices. Sorry, was regarded secondary as the sales of machines. So the company basically was wanted to sell machines. Yeah, so it was not really to make the matrices. Yeah, they were just a secondary thing, the matrices. According to Gabeyan, at least 30 phones could be sold over 5 years to existing customers in Middle East territories. However, it was unlikely that Armenian printers would order a linotype machine only because a new typeface was made available. And Armenian printers could not always really afford to buy new machines, and they would prefer second-hand ones. So the financial struggle of Armenian printers was an issue on the production of Armenian typefaces. Due to the limited potential market for Armenian linotype machines and the unpromising sales prospect of Awetisean's matrices, linotype machinery considered it unprofitable to produce Awetisean's typeface for hot metal composition. I cannot think of a better way of concluding this section than by quoting Ran Gabeyan. In 1970, I described Awetisean's italic as superb, and I still do, because most of the newspapers and the books I read during those years were set in italic. So go used to, like every other Armenian outside Armenia, to read italic more than the upright style, and the generation started preferring italic out of habit. If in 1970 I judged Awetisean's typeface as being superb, I think I was right, because it was a far better italic typeface than the one we used to have, and which was common and almost the only one used by most typesetters. As observed from Gabeyan's work, his appreciation for the italic in 1970 was from the viewpoint of an Armenian reader. Awetisean's italic typeface looked unconventional compared to historical models. Letter widths and proportions were atypical. Gabeyan's comment is evidence that the success of a typeface does not necessarily imply that its design is of the best quality. Linotype might have refused to develop Armenian fonts for their machines, but this does not detract from the importance of the role played by the Armenian diaspora in Lebanon and Cairo. Their contribution to the development of Armenian typefaces for hot metal and phototypesetting technologies merits a place into the history of Armenian type design. Finally, we want to observe the impact of Latinization on 21st century newspapers. Today, the Armenian script is used by almost 3 million people living in Armenia and about 8 million Armenians spread all over the world, the diaspora. Now we're going to consider the press scene in Yerevan. I examined 4 newspapers published in 2012, 4 in 2017, and 10 in 2022. A few newspapers currently published in Yerevan make use of highly Latinized typefaces for the headings and body text, showing features such as serifs and Latin letters. Noticeable are Latin letters such as S, R, H, and N, which first appeared in the 19th century. There are also other letters that were altered by using Latin glyphs, such as letter Sh, which was designed using the Latin letter S, and T, that uses Latin letter P. So this kind of typefaces might be considered as highly legible in Armenia, since they have been in use for more than 10 years by these newspapers. According to type designer Susanna Lichko, legibility depends on familiarity. You read best what you read the most. Only 1 out of 10 newspapers published in 2022 uses a serif font. This typeface is Marianne, designed by Onnik Awetisean in 2008. It has become one of the official fonts of the Armenian government. However, the use of serifs on both sides of vertical stems makes this typeface look Latinized. For the sake of saving space, the tendency amongst newspapers is for the printed text to be typeset at a relatively small size, sometimes with narrow letter spacing, thus causing letters to collide and compromise legibility. At small sizes, the length of the ending strokes of letters such as da, ka, and v is an important feature that helps avoiding confusions between letters that present similarities. The same can apply also to the length of ascenders and descenders. The layout of newspapers is strongly influenced by Western practice, but the visual hierarchy sometimes differ. Whereas some Armenian newspapers differentiate information using different weights, particularly bold, as would be expected in Latin newspapers, Aravot and Ayastania Repututiun show limited visual hierarchy. They use regular and bold respectively, and the hierarchy of information is partially achieved by changing the size of the type. The online editions of most Armenian newspapers published in Armenia use Noto Sans Armenian. This is the case with Armen Press Online, the oldest and largest news agency in Armenia. Once again, it shows reader preference for an upright sans serif font. Contemporary publications in Yerevan strongly contrast with the trend observed amid the Armenian diaspora. They favor a more traditional Bolorgir style. This is evidenced by Norarach on the right side of the screen. And Armenian newspapers published in France and available in printed form and online. Oops, sorry, skip a slide. The first issue of this printed journal appeared towards the end of 2009. So I'm still talking about the one on the right side of the screen. So it was 4 months after the closure of the longest running independent publication, Harach, which you can see on the left side of the screen. It was the only daily newspaper in France entirely written in Armenian. Back in 2008, Harach was still printed using Latinised Armenian hot metal type. So this was done in 1913. So it seems somehow to reinforce a sense of attachment to the past. Norarach, as you can see, the one on the right, uses a slanted traditional Bolorgir typeface for the body text and an upright Armenian font as a secondary style for direct quotation. Extensive use of a slanted Bolorgir style by Parisian newspapers shows again the strong attachment of the French Armenian community to the traditional style. The online version of Norarach takes a slightly different approach. The Armenian typeface has been designed to match the Latin counterpart used for the French version. It has a traditional look, but an upright stand. Most of the online Armenian newspapers use Not Armenian, even the online version of Asbarets, with a readership over 500,000 in west of the United States. It's entirely typeset in Noto Sans Armenian. However, unexpectedly, the special issue of Asbarets, dated 16 July 2022, made available in PDF format, uses for its headings and the main text in a couple of pages a digitized version of what looks like one of the typefaces used by Čanik Aramean in Colombe du Massis, so it's quite Latinized. In contrast, the remaining pages show a traditional slanted Bolorgir style. A similar approach is followed by Massis, the official publication of a social democratic Antrakian party in the west of the United States. So again, we have this contrast between the traditional Bolurgir and the upright Armenian. In Lebanon, the Beirut Armenian newspaper Zartong take a modern approach, comparing the appearance of a page from Zartong in 1990 and the 2022 issue. The 1990 publication has a very traditional look. The 2022 issue looks definitely modern. From this, it becomes clear that readers' preferences can change over time and might even reflect changes in political context. Here, the former version was published before the independence of Armenia, which happened in 1991. It is now time for me to conclude. Changes to the Armenian typographic script in the 19th century have had an enormous impact on the development of subsequent Armenian typefaces. Extensive use of an upright style and modified vertical proportions have become widely accepted conventions. It should be noted that at no time was the reform on the Armenian Bolurgi style forcibly introduced or imposed. Rather, it was encouraged, initiated, and sometimes adopted by printers and publishers. An important reason behind Armenians modernizing their script in the 19th and 20th centuries was economic factors. A good illustration of this is given by Linotype's refusal to develop Awetisean's type. We have seen that in the case of Armenian typefaces, both preservation and modernization are expressions of cultural identity. Newspapers in the diaspora reveal some attachment to the old style, reflecting a desire to safeguard Armenian cultural heritage and to prevent the traditional script from being lost to future generations. This attachment to tradition does not imply refusal of modern forms. Finally, the Armenian press has always contributed to building a bridge between the homeland and the diaspora. The coexistence of traditional and modern typefaces in publications might be a means of achieving a certain degree of convergence. Thank you so much. Merci, Čanik.